It was supposed to be a day like any other. Sheriff Rebecca Becky Caldwell had just finished her shift and was heading home, ready to unwind in the comfort of her family. A normal night, a normal routine. But the moment she stepped through the front door, something felt off. The air was thick with a tension that made her stomach churn. The house was quiet, too quiet. Then, from the bedroom, a sound. Soft, muffled, like a scream that never fully formed. The kind of noise that doesn't just reach your ears. It grips your soul before your mind even has time to process it. Her heart pounded as she rushed down the hall, adrenaline surging through her veins. But nothing could have prepared her for what she was about to see. There, in the dim light of their bedroom, was Nathan Caldwell, the man she had trusted, the man she had loved, caught in the most unspeakable act. Frozen in time, he turned, his face a mask of shock and guilt. And beside him, trembling and terrified, was their 10-year-old daughter, Sarah. In that instant, the world shattered. The love, the trust, the life Becky had built. It all crumbled into dust. Her hands shook as the weight of the moment bore down on her, the horror pressing against her chest like a vice. And then, something inside her broke. I didn't scream. I didn't call for backup. I didn't even blink, she would later recall. I knew what I had to do. In that moment, the badge didn't matter. The law didn't matter. All that mattered was justice. And justice wasn't going to wait. What happened next was a decision that would change everything. Not just for Becky, not just for Sarah, but for everyone who would come to hear this story. Some call it vengeance. Others call it justice. But no one could have predicted how far she would go to make sure Nathan Caldwell would never hurt anyone again. Welcome to Crime Chronicles, where we dive deep into the darkest tales of love, lies, and betrayal. If you're new here, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because today's case will leave you speechless.
It was a quiet, hot summer day when Becky Caldwell sat on the porch of the small house she had grown up in, the dust of Texas swirling around her. The sun beat down relentlessly, but it didn't bother her. Growing up in a town like this, you learn to love the heat. You also learn to value what mattered most: family, faith, and law. Her father, a veteran officer, had taught her from a young age what it meant to have integrity. Be honest, be strong, and always protect those who can't protect themselves, he would tell her. She never forgot those words. Becky had always known this town would be her life. As a young woman, she dreamed of following in her father's footsteps, becoming someone the town could trust. And that's exactly what she did. She joined the police force right out of high school. It wasn't easy. People didn't expect much from a woman in a small town's law enforcement. But Becky proved them wrong. Through the years, she earned her badge, not by asking for respect, but by demanding it. So she quickly rose through the ranks, becoming sheriff. People trusted her because they knew she stood for what was right. She didn't care if the case was big or small. Her motto was simple: justice first, no exceptions. However, being sheriff wasn't just about making arrests. It was about dealing with the human side of things: the wrecked marriages, the broken families, the lies that people told themselves to sleep at night. And through it all, Becky remained unwavering. No matter the hardship, no matter the betrayal, she believed in justice. Always. And then there is Nathan Caldwell. He wasn't a man you could forget. A towering figure in the community, Nathan had built his life on faith. As a preacher at the local church, he was the embodiment of grace and honor, or so it seemed. Every Sunday, people would fill the pews, hanging on his every word, as if his voice was a direct connection to God. "Let us pray," he would say, and people would bow their heads in unison. His charm was undeniable. People trusted him with their most personal struggles, their marriages, their children. To them, Nathan was a man who walked the path of righteousness, who believed deeply in family values, and who held the sanctity of marriage above all else. But behind closed doors, Nathan's charisma masked something darker. No one saw the cracks in his character, his smirking glances when he thought no one was watching, the way his gaze would linger on women in the congregation just a little too long. At home, he was a devoted father to Sarah. He played with her, helped her with her homework, and took her to church on Sundays. He was the perfect image of a father, kind, loving, always present. But there was something about Nathan that Becky couldn't quite shake. She couldn't pinpoint it, but she felt it deep down in her gut, like a warning sign flashing in her mind. So she told herself it was nothing. He was the preacher after all. And she loved him. They had built a life together, a perfect life. Or so she thought. And Sarah was the light of Becky's life. At just 10 years old, she had a joy and innocence that was contagious. She had her mother's eyes, her father's laugh, and a smile that could brighten even the darkest of days. Becky adored her daughter with every fiber of her being. She was her everything, the reason she woke up every day, the reason she fought so hard to be the woman she was. Sarah had a closeness with her mother that was unspoken but strong. They had shared so many special moments dressing up for church, walking hand in hand down the streets of town, talking about the future, and Sarah loved her father. She would often climb into his lap, listen to his stories, and dream of the day she would grow up and be just like him, just like the man who everyone in town looked up to. She believed him to be the kindest, most loving father in the world. But then, everything changed. That trust, that bond, would soon be shattered in a way no one could have predicted. Inside, Becky was a mother first. No matter how many criminals she arrested, no matter how many cases she closed, Sarah was the heart of her life. Her love for her daughter was unconditional, fierce, and protective. She would do anything to keep Sarah safe, to give her the life she deserved. It was a typical day for Sheriff Becky Caldwell. She had left for work early that morning, as she always did. The sun had barely begun to rise as she headed out to the precinct, preparing herself for another long day of keeping her small town safe. The criminal they had been after for weeks had finally been apprehended early that afternoon, and there was no need for her to stay longer than expected. It was an unusual stroke of luck, a quick win, and for once she could return home a little earlier than usual. As Becky drove back to the house, she wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary. The familiar drive down the narrow road leading to their house was peaceful. She always looked forward to coming home and hearing the sound of Sarah's excited footsteps running down the driveway to greet her. "Mommy, Mommy, welcome home!" She could already imagine her daughter's voice, the joy in her words. But today, as Becky pulled into the driveway, she noticed something strange. The house was quieter than usual. There was no sight of Sarah. No running footsteps, no excited shout of "Mummy!" Instead, there was an eerie stillness that immediately set Becky's nerves on edge. She frowned. Where was Sarah? She stepped out of the car and scanned the front yard. No sign of her husband either. Nothing seemed right. She expected to see Nathan, perhaps coming out to greet her, but there was no movement, no welcoming hug, nothing. A sense of unease gripped her, and she immediately felt the pit in her stomach grow. Something was wrong. Becky's instincts kicked in. She immediately began walking toward the front door, her steps cautious and deliberate. Her eyes darted around the yard, searching for any sign of her family. But there was nothing. With each step closer to the house, the air seemed to thicken, the tension rising in her chest. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. She pushed open the door slowly and entered, her hand still on the handle. It was too quiet. No sounds of Sarah playing, no chatter, no usual energy. She tiptoed across the hallway, each step feeling like it echoed louder than it should have. The house felt strangely empty. She moved with purpose, but as she made her way deeper into the house, her senses heightened. There was something in the air, a shift in the atmosphere that couldn't be ignored. That was when she heard it. A muffled sound coming from the bedroom. A voice, soft but desperate. "Please stop, no, please don't." The words were faint but clear enough for Becky to make out. Her heart skipped a beat. That was Sarah's voice. But what was happening? What was going on? Becky froze in place. Every part of her body screamed for her to stay still, to listen harder. She could feel the air grow colder around her, and with a sense of dread crawling up her spine, she took a deep breath, and in a sudden rush of adrenaline she began to move silently toward the bedroom door. Her steps were measured, deliberate. Each footfall seemed heavier than the last, and the closer she got to the door, the louder the muffled sounds became. Her mind raced with worry, panic creeping in, but she kept moving. As she reached the door, she took a deep breath and pushed it open, stepping inside. And then she saw it. Becky's eyes locked onto the horrific scene unfolding in front of her. There was Nathan, her husband, the man she had spent years with, raised a daughter with, trusted completely. But there he was, in an act of unimaginable betrayal, with Sarah, their daughter, crying out in pain. It was as if the room itself was closing in around her. The world felt like it was tilting, her mind racing to make sense of the nightmare before her. Her pulse hammered in her ears. She felt as though she might collapse. Was this real? Was this some kind of sick joke? Or was she dreaming? Her heart was in her throat, and every instinct in her body screamed at her to do something, anything. She couldn't just stand there. But in that moment, she was frozen. Shock paralyzed her. Her breath caught in her chest as the weight of the reality crashed down on her. Nathan, still in his dazed state, turned slowly, eyes widening as he realized Becky was standing there in the doorway. His face quickly shifted from confusion to panic. "Honey? What? No, you don't understand. I'm just helping her, just making sure she's okay," he stammered, his voice shaky, yet trying to hold on to the ever-present charm that had always protected him. But Becky couldn't hear him. She didn't want to hear him. Her eyes, locked onto her husband, saw only the monster he had become. She couldn't think. She couldn't breathe. Her hands were shaking, but her resolve was hardening. For years she had been the law, the protector, the one who upheld justice no matter what. But in that moment, as she stood there watching Nathan try to justify his actions, the lines blurred. And then came the heart-wrenching cry of Sarah, her little body trembling as she shouted, "Mommy! Mommy! Please save me! Save me, Mommy!" Becky's stomach twisted as her daughter's words seared into her soul. This wasn't the first time. It couldn't be. Every fiber of her being screamed that she had failed as a mother, as a wife, but most of all, as a protector. "I can't believe you're doing this right now. I can't believe it." Becky's voice shook with a mixture of anger and pain as she stepped closer, her body taut with rage. The man she had loved, trusted, he wasn't the person she thought he was. No, this was something else, something far darker. Nathan's manipulation began immediately, the practiced words spilling from his mouth, trying to worm his way back into her good graces. "Becky, calm down. This isn't what you think. I was trying to help her. She needs me. You don't understand, Becky." But Becky wasn't listening anymore. The words no longer made sense. This wasn't the man she thought she knew. He had manipulated her for years, and now it was over. Becky's hands tightened into fists. "You don't get to do this anymore," she said, her voice cold, empty of the love she had once felt for him. Her training as a sheriff, her years of physical preparation, kicked in. Without thinking, she lunged forward, knocking Nathan off balance with a move that came effortlessly from years of practice. He crumpled to the floor, almost unconscious before he could even process what had just happened. She stood over him, her heart pounding, her body still humming with adrenaline. She didn't look at him with pity. She looked at him with finality. "This is it," she whispered to herself. "This is the last time you hurt her. The last time I ever let you get away with this." "You can't do this, Becky," he said, his voice steady, as though he was still in control. "You're a sheriff. You know this isn't the way. The law is on my side. You're going to regret this. You can't keep me here like this. You're the one breaking the law now." His words hung in the air, but they weren't the truth. He had broken the law long before Becky had walked in that room. But Nathan wasn't done yet. He used his position, his influence in the church, to manipulate Becky further. "I've got connections. You think you can just do this? You think the community will stand by you? Think again." His eyes narrowed as he tried to hold on to his last bit of power, his voice dripping with false righteousness. But Becky stood firm. She had heard it all before. The lies, the justifications. This time, they wouldn't work. "You're never going to do this again," Becky spat, her voice cold and sharp, each word like a vow. Her hand pressed down on his balls. Nathan's body buckled in pain, his cries barely escaping his throat as he attempted to break free. The sound of his groaning was drowned out by the sound of his rapid, shallow breathing. He fell to the floor, completely incapacitated, his body writhing in pain as blood began to pool beneath him. For a moment, all Becky could do was stand there, watching him as he struggled to breathe, as the realization of what he had done washed over him. The silence in the room was thick and suffocating, broken only by Nathan's moans and the sound of Becky's heavy breathing. Her eyes, once filled with shock, now held nothing but determination. She had seen enough. There was no going back now. But the moment didn't last. The sound of footsteps, hurried and urgent, echoed down the hallway. The sheriff's deputies, who had been scheduled to visit Becky for a routine check-in, arrived just in time to witness the chaos. "What the hell is going on?" one of them asked, confusion lacing his voice as he stepped into the room. They froze when they saw Nathan bleeding on the floor, his face pale and twisted in agony. The respected pastor, a pillar of the community, now lay vulnerable, broken, and helpless before the very woman who had once called him her husband. Without hesitation, the deputies rushed to Nathan's side. They had no idea what had happened, but they understood one thing. Their sheriff had done something. Something that couldn't be undone. "Sheriff, we need to get him to the hospital," one of the deputies said, his voice uncertain but firm. Becky didn't flinch. She didn't look away. "Do what you need to do," she replied, her voice low but unwavering. "Just make sure he gets the care he deserves." The deputies exchanged uneasy glances, their loyalty torn between the woman they trusted and the man they once admired. But without further words, they took Nathan and rushed him out of the house, leaving Becky standing in the doorway, her mind racing. As the sound of the ambulance's siren faded into the distance, Becky remained motionless. She had taken justice into her own hands, and now she would have to face the consequences. The choices she made in that room would change everything. They would change her life, the life of her daughter, and the lives of everyone around her. And as the weight of it all settled on her, Becky knew that what had just happened was only the beginning. The sheriff's precinct buzzed with its usual hum of activity. The deputies were scattered around, having their typical morning discussions. Papers shuffled around as coffee cups clinked against the counter. It was an ordinary day, just like any other. But then Becky Caldwell walked in. Her entrance stopped the entire room. The noise from the conversations abruptly died. All eyes turned toward her, and the energy shifted instantly. The usual confidence in her step, the assured presence of someone who led with conviction, was now tempered with something else, something heavier, something that felt like a weight had been placed on her shoulders. Becky held her badge in her hand, fingers tight around it as though it were her last connection to who she used to be. The space in the room seemed to constrict as she walked forward, her footsteps echoing through the silence. She reached the desk, her movement decisive. With one swift motion, she slapped her badge down onto the desk, the sound of it reverberating through the room. A tense, electric silence filled the space. No one moved, no one spoke. Deputy Roberts was the first to react. He took a step forward, his eyes flickering between Becky and the badge, struggling to process what he was seeing. He had known her for years, had trusted her, had followed her lead countless times. But now? Now, there was no understanding, just confusion and disbelief. His voice barely broke through the thick silence as his gaze remained fixed on her. "Sheriff?" His voice faltered. "What's going on?" His confusion deepened, his eyes darting between her face and the badge on the desk. Becky met his gaze, unwavering. The look in her eyes wasn't one of hesitation but of finality. Her voice, low and calm, carried an undeniable weight. "I've done something I need to turn myself in." The words hung in the air, thick and impossible to ignore. For a long moment, Deputy Roberts stood still, processing the gravity of her statement. His eyes shifted nervously toward Deputy Clark, who stood a few feet away. Clark had been Becky's confidant, someone who had seen the sheriff in every possible situation, but even now his expression mirrored the uncertainty that had overtaken the room. Deputy Roberts blinked, his expression one of disbelief. He quickly turned toward Deputy Clark, who stood behind him, still rooted to the spot. It was clear neither of them knew how to handle the situation. Clark took a hesitant step forward, his confusion written all over his face. "Wait, what? What do you mean? What's happened?" Becky stood motionless, her hands still resting on the desk, her fingers curled around the cold metal of her badge. She was no longer the sheriff they admired, the leader they respected. She was something else now, a mother who had made a choice, no matter the cost. "I'm the one who hurt him, Nathan. I did it." The room went silent, the shock settling over them like a heavy fog. The deputies exchanged uneasy glances, their expressions unreadable. The reality of her words hit harder than anything else that had come before. They had known Becky for years. She had been their rock, their guide. But now, she was the one who had shattered the peace. She had crossed a line, and they didn't know if they could or should follow her into this new world she had created. For a moment, no one spoke. The usual rush of thoughts and questions couldn't find their way through the silence. They were stuck in disbelief, caught in the gravity of the confession. Becky's decision had thrust them into an uncharted territory. Some of them had worked alongside her for years, and in that moment it seemed impossible to reconcile the woman they knew with the one who had just admitted to a crime so unimaginable. Deputy Roberts finally took a shaky breath and took a step back. He wasn't questioning her authority, but his mind was racing, trying to make sense of this. What could have driven her to this? "Did you really?" he whispered, barely able to speak the words. Becky nodded, her face unreadable. There was no remorse in her eyes, no sign of hesitation. She knew what she had done, and for better or worse she had made her peace with it. "I did what I had to do, and now I'm ready to face the consequences." The deputies exchanged glances again, this time in complete silence. They had trusted her, admired her, even looked up to her as a figure of strength. But now, they had to come to terms with the fact that their sheriff had committed an act that could never be undone. They weren't just witnessing a confession, they were witnessing the unraveling of the woman who had once been the pillar of their town's sense of law and order. As soon as the news of Becky's confession broke, it felt as though the entire town had been struck by lightning. The atmosphere shifted from routine to chaos in an instant. News vans began to line the streets, reporters descended in droves, and soon the once quiet town was alive with the sound of camera shutters and the murmur of gossip. Questions flooded every conversation. How could this happen? What had pushed Becky, the sheriff they had trusted, to do something so unthinkable? The town, which had long viewed her as an immovable pillar of law and order, now found itself asking who she really was. The media was relentless. A news anchor's voice echoed from a television in a nearby store as the town's residents watched in disbelief. Sheriff Becky Caldwell turned herself in today after admitting to a violent act against her husband, Nathan Caldwell, the respected local pastor. Her confession has stunned the community, leaving residents questioning their trust in the woman who had once represented law and order. The words seemed to hang in the air, reverberating through every corner of the town. People stood frozen in the streets, trying to process the weight of the news. Some couldn't fathom it. Others began to form their opinions, but no one could deny that this was a turning point. As the news settled, the town split into two distinct factions. On one side, there were those who rallied behind Becky. They saw her as a hero, a mother who had finally fought back after years of hidden torment. To them, Becky's actions were justified, even heroic. She had no choice, some would say, shaking their heads. Nathan was a monster, and no matter how much people loved him, he got what he deserved. That man had it coming. Yet, on the other side, there were those who couldn't reconcile what she had done. "But she's the sheriff," they argued, disbelief creeping into their voices. "She's the one who's supposed to uphold the law, not break it. She can't just take matters into her own hands like that. No one is above the law, not even her." Then, there were the people who stood somewhere in between, unsure how to process what had unfolded. "I don't know what to think," one neighbor muttered to another as they stood in the local diner, trying to make sense of it. "I've known Becky for years. She's always been so strong, so reliable. But this is beyond what I can wrap my head around. It's just unbelievable." The town was divided. It wasn't just about the crime anymore. It was about who Becky was now. Was she a woman wronged, seeking justice in the only way she knew how? Or was she a criminal, someone who had abandoned her duty in favor of vengeance? The conversation shifted quickly from shock to judgment, each person weighing the situation through their own lens. But Nathan lay in the sterile white hospital room, bloodied but very much alive. The pain was nothing compared to the fury that simmered beneath the surface. His eyes, though weak from the attack, were cold and calculating. He had survived, and now he was determined to make sure that he came out on top. His mind raced through the possibilities, plotting his next move. He couldn't just let this go. Becky had taken everything from him, but in his twisted view, she was about to make the biggest mistake of her life. As soon as he regained enough strength to speak, he picked up the phone, calling his lawyer. His voice was hoarse, but the venom laced in every word was unmistakable. "I need you to listen to me," Nathan said, his words sharp despite the pain. "She's lying. She fabricated the whole thing. She's trying to ruin me. I've been a good man, a man of God, but this is insane." His anger was palpable, but underneath it all there was something colder, something calculating. Nathan had never been one to back down from a fight, especially not one that threatened his reputation. In his mind, this was a battle, and he wasn't about to lose. Nathan wasn't going to leave anything to chance. He started calling everyone who would listen, his closest allies, the people in his church, and anyone with influence. He needed to control the narrative, to paint himself as the victim. To a close ally, Nathan made sure to plant the seeds of doubt. "You have to understand, she's always been jealous," he said, his voice cold. "It wasn't the first time she's overreacted to something. She's unstable. She's a ticking time bomb. And now look what she's done. She thinks she's above the law." His words were laced with venom, but also with a well-practiced charm that made them sound convincing. Nathan was no stranger to manipulation. It was a tool he had wielded for years, whether in his role as a pastor or as a husband. He knew how to twist the truth, how to make himself appear as the victim while shifting blame to others. And this time, Becky was his target. His ties to the local church and law enforcement gave him the upper hand. His charm was so effective that many found themselves questioning Becky's integrity, even those who had respected her for years. Nathan was turning the tables, using everything in his power to control the narrative, and as Nathan's legal team began to assemble, it became clear that this wasn't just a fight for his personal freedom. This was a battle to destroy Becky, her career, her reputation, and her life. He wasn't going to let her get away with what she had done. From his hospital bed, he began to rally support, reaching out to influential figures within the church and law enforcement. His reputation as a man of faith, combined with his silver-tongued manipulation, allowed him to paint himself as the victim while Becky became the villain. He had his lawyer spread rumors about Becky's mental state, questioning her stability. "She's always had a temper," the lawyer was told to say, "and her jealousy has been an issue for years. This isn't the first time she's lashed out. But now she's taken it too far." Nathan knew exactly what he was doing. He was setting the stage for the legal battle to come, making sure that Becky's actions would be framed as premeditated, a result of her own instability. And if he could twist the story just right, he might even make Becky look like a dangerous, unhinged woman who had been hiding her true nature all along. And as the trial date approached, the media descended upon the town like a swarm of vultures. News crews filled the courthouse, cameras set up to capture every detail. Reporters stalked Nathan and Becky, eager to get a soundbite that would boost their ratings. The once peaceful town had become a circus, with every word and action magnified under the scrutiny of the press. Outside the courthouse, protesters gathered in divided groups, each group representing a different view of the case. Some held signs that read, "Justice for Sarah," while others carried placards that demanded Becky be held accountable for her actions. The atmosphere was tense, electric with anger and confusion. But inside the courtroom, the battle between Becky's defense team and the prosecution became a war of words. Becky's defense tried to argue that her actions were a desperate, impulsive act born out of love for her daughter. They portrayed her as a mother who had reached her breaking point, unable to watch her child suffer any longer. But the prosecution had a different story. They painted Becky as a cold, calculating individual who had planned the attack for weeks. They argued that her actions were premeditated and that she had no regard for the law. They emphasized the brutality of the assault, highlighting the severity of Nathan's injuries. As Becky took the stand, the room fell silent. Her voice was calm, but the emotion behind her words was undeniable. "I didn't plan this. I didn't want this," she said, her eyes glistening with tears. "But I couldn't let it happen again. I was a mother first. I'm sorry for what I did, but I'm not sorry for protecting my daughter." Her words were raw, but the damage was done. The courtroom was divided. Some saw her as a hero, a woman pushed too far by a monster. Others saw her as a criminal, someone who had taken the law into her own hands. When Nathan took the stand, he was a master of manipulation. He spoke in a cold, calculated manner, his eyes piercing and his tone sharp. "I've been betrayed," he said, his voice filled with false hurt. "This was all a lie. She's making this up to cover her own guilt. I never touched her. Never. And now my life is destroyed. My reputation is ruined because of her jealousy and her lies." His testimony was filled with half-truths and outright lies, but he delivered it with such confidence that many in the courtroom began to doubt Becky's version of events. Nathan was turning the tide. But as the trial continued, new evidence began to emerge, evidence that would shake the town to its core. Investigators uncovered a network of corruption, manipulation, and abuse that stretched far beyond Nathan and Becky. The people of the town, who had turned a blind eye to the darker aspects of their community, were about to learn just how deep the rot went. Detectives whispered to each other as they uncovered documents, old reports, and testimonies that pointed to other women and girls who had fallen victim to Nathan's twisted charm. Some had even disappeared without a trace. The revelation was staggering. Nathan hadn't just manipulated Becky. He had manipulated an entire town. "This goes far beyond just Becky and Nathan," one of the detectives said, his voice shaking with the weight of the truth. "There's a whole network, people in power who've been covering for him for years. This is going to rock this whole town." And then, the moment that everyone had been waiting for arrived. Sarah, the key to everything, was finally called to testify. She had remained silent throughout the entire ordeal, protected by her mother, and now, with the world watching, it was time for her to speak. Sarah's testimony left the courtroom in stunned silence. He said it was okay, she whispered, her voice shaking. He said I had to keep it a secret, but it wasn't okay. I was scared. I was always scared. It has happened for at least 5 years now. Her words were a devastating blow to Nathan's defense. The courtroom, once filled with doubt, was now frozen in horror. Nathan's carefully constructed facade began to crumble, and the truth came crashing down around him. The world now knew the full extent of his manipulation, and Becky's actions, while violent, suddenly seemed a desperate attempt to protect her child from a man who had evaded justice for far too long. After Sarah's emotional testimony, the courtroom felt as though it had been struck by a thunderclap. The air was thick with disbelief as the truth about Nathan Caldwell, once the town's beloved preacher, came crashing down. For years, Nathan had built his reputation as a man of faith, a pillar of the community. His sermons were filled with fire and brimstone, invoking the name of God as if he had a direct line to heaven itself. He had led a double life, preaching love and forgiveness while harboring a dark, twisted secret. But now, as Sarah spoke the painful truth, the facade crumbled. As the words left Sarah's lips, the once loyal followers who had rallied behind Nathan now found themselves grappling with a horrifying realization. Their trusted leader, the man they had admired, had been manipulating them all along. His kindness had been a mask for his cruelty, and his faith was nothing but a tool for control. They had been deceived, just like Becky. People who had once stood by Nathan now turned their backs on him. Their faces were filled with anger, shock, and disbelief. Some of them couldn't even look at him anymore. What had they been worshipping all these years? How could they have allowed a man like him to hold so much power? His betrayal cut deeper than anything they had imagined. The town, it seemed, had been living in a lie. It was as if they had all been living under a delusion, wrapped up in a story of faith that had never been true. The hypocrisy was more than they could bear. Some even whispered that this was worse than the betrayal of Judas. Nathan had deceived everyone, using their trust and faith as tools to hide his malevolent actions. The very church that had once rallied behind him now felt like a house of cards, ready to fall. As the trial reached its climax, it became undeniable who the real culprit was. Nathan Caldwell, once the revered man of God, was now exposed for the predator he truly was. The court couldn't ignore the weight of the evidence, especially after Sarah's brave testimony. There was no more room for denial. The judge, after a long deliberation, sentenced Nathan to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The decision felt almost like a relief for the town finally. Justice was served. Nathan would never hurt anyone again, at least not in the way he had before. And as the officers escorted him out of the courtroom, Nathan's face was twisted in disbelief. He had manipulated so many people, but now the truth had caught up to him. He would no longer be able to control anyone, least of all himself. The very power he had once wielded, the influence he had over the church and the law, had all crumbled. For Nathan, the life he had carefully built had ended in ruins. His reputation as a pastor, a family man, had been shattered, and his future was now locked behind prison bars. The town that had once admired him could only look on in disgust as he was led away. But on the other hand, the story of Becky Caldwell took a different turn. The court was faced with the challenge of holding her accountable for her actions that, while violent, had been driven by a mother's desperate need to protect her child. Becky had crossed a line, but the court couldn't ignore the factors that weighed in her favor. First, there was the fact that she had allowed the deputies to take Nathan to the hospital. Despite everything, she had not fled the scene. She hadn't tried to hide what she had done. That single moment was pivotal. It showed that despite her actions, Becky wasn't trying to escape the consequences of her decision. She had taken responsibility in the most difficult way possible. Second, there was her voluntary confession. She hadn't waited for the law to find out the truth. She hadn't tried to cover up her crime. Instead, she had walked into the precinct, slapped her badge on the desk, and admitted what she had done. In an act of pure courage, she took ownership of her actions without hesitation. These two factors played a significant role in the final verdict. They painted a picture of a woman who, despite her lapse in judgment, had acted out of love and desperation, not malice. She had done what any mother would do to protect her child. In the end, the court exonerated Becky. She was set free, but not without conditions. The judge ordered that she be placed under house arrest for a few months and that she attend anger management classes. It was a necessary step to ensure that she could regain control over her emotions and her life. Becky's relief was obvious, but she knew this was just the beginning of her journey to reclaim herself. She had made a choice, one that had changed the course of her life and the life of her daughter. Now she would have to live with the consequences of that decision. But for Becky, freedom, though restricted, felt like a victory, a small step toward healing. Becky's story had come to an end in the courtroom, but it was just the beginning of the healing process. The town would never be the same. The truth had been laid bare, and with it, the darker side of the town had been exposed. The twisted secrets that had been hidden for so long were now out in the open. People would never look at Nathan or Becky the same way again. For Becky, justice had come at a steep cost, and the road to redemption was still long and uncertain. But as she faced the consequences of her actions, she also had the comfort of knowing that, in the end, she had done what any mother would have done. In the end, Becky's story is not just a tragedy, it's a powerful reminder of the lengths a mother will go to protect her child and the complex consequences of justice when the law itself seems to fail. It's a cautionary tale about the dark power of secrets, betrayal, and manipulation, and how even the most trusted figures can hide a sinister truth beneath their public persona. So I ask you, was Becky justified in her actions, driven by a mother's unyielding love and the need to protect her daughter? Or was she simply a woman who crossed a line she could never come back from? And if you were in her shoes, with everything on the line, your family, your career, your community, what would you have done? Would you have taken matters into your own hands? Or would you have let the law run its course, no matter how imperfect it might be? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. These are the kinds of questions that challenge our beliefs about justice, love, and morality. And perhaps they never truly have an answer. If this story left you speechless, please like, comment, and share so others can understand the painful choices that come with betrayal and the battle for justice. And if you want more real-life stories like this, stories of love, revenge, and the devastating consequences of secrets, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. There are still countless more stories to uncover, and some of them are darker than this one.